My name's Pete Bearder. I go often by the name of Pete the Temp as a stage name. I've been a professional performance poet for around about 10 years. I'm going to be taking us through the constellation of what we're looking at here. A lot is talked about bodies of literature and the literary corpus. We're going to be looking at the bodies that make up performance poetics, the planetary bodies, if you like. So let's orientate ourselves. How do we get here? Spoken word, the tradition of spoken word. This is a graphic from my book. What you see in red is the history of Homo sapiens, where the principal form of expressive communication and intellectual transmission, what Havelock calls versified knowledge, has been through the oral tradition. Poetics and oral artistry have been a huge part of that. You've got partial literacy very recently, and mass literacy even more recently. So if you're looking at the oral tradition, you're looking at something which is incredibly old and also incredibly complex. Quote here from Paul Zumthor: oral poetry generally has more rules and more complex ones than the majority of written forms. In predominantly oral societies, oral poetry is often much more elaborate than are the majority of our written productions. Okay, so it's not only very old, but it's very, very complex. Yeah, that's all I want to say on that. So a little bit, and really this is only something that academia in the West has been studying since the 1960s, so we've really only scratched the surface of this. A quick trivia here: who can tell me, I know someone in the room is going to be able to get this right, what is the oldest European academic subject? Rhetoric, absolutely, yes. Rhetoric is the art of speech making, is the oldest academic subject. This is slam style ancient Greece. So what happened since then? Well, English literature has only been an academic subject really since about the 1830s. So only very recently. Before that, it was mostly the classics, Latin and Greek, that was studied. So English literature has only been around a very tiny amount of time, and pretty much no sooner had it begun that oral poetics was siphoned off. Literary criticism split in the early 20th century from theatre studies, and there's many historical processes that I want to feed into how we got here that I don't have time to go into. But the important thing to remember is that the ideology of new criticism consciously said anything that's beyond the box of text on the page is outside of our consideration. So the biography of the poet, the historical moment that they're teaching in, the context of performance was deemed inconsiderable for the subject of poetry. And yeah, I mean, new criticism doesn't quite have the stranglehold it once does, but it has had a huge influence on the education institutions that teach poetry. Okay. The phonograph, 1877, we worked out how we could record and reproduce audio recordings. So in 3 years' time, 2 years' time, we'll be celebrating 150 years of the ability to listen back to poetry. And one of the first poets of the canon was Alfred Lord Tennyson. George Edison, who invented this machine, gave a machine to Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I encourage you to go on YouTube and listen to what must be the most significant poetry recording that we have in this country. It's a haunting voice from the past. Now, audio recording has come a long way since then. Of course, you've got vinyl, tape, analog, digital recording, but 150 years on, there really is no excuse for the lack of an established methodology for studying oral poetry. Okay? So moving on now, we're going to look at some of the artistic traditions that are feeding into this. Of course, we've got literature, theatre, music, stand-up, rhetoric, liturgy, religious incantations and the like. Also experimental poetry here. I think this often gets overlooked when we're talking about spoken word. What links the Dada poet, sound poet, avant-garde poet of Hugo Ball to David J? If you ask Hannah Silver over here nicely, maybe she'll send you her PhD thesis that will tell you that, but that will answer that question. And I think this is an interest. I mean, avant-garde experimental sound poetry is a form of performance poetry and also deserves attention, I think. Okay, so that's a quick bit on the artistic stuff. The human body. When we're publishing through performance, when we're publishing with the human body, this comes with a whole raft of things that deserve study. Of course, the way that we use sound, the way that we use our voice, How do the sonic properties of poetry carry meaning? The percussive qualities, the ideophones, the sound effects. How does this feed in and enrich the text when it comes through performance? Movement here. Kinesics, the study of body movement and gesture, posture, facial expression, eye contact, choreography, dance. How do these things feed into poetry? How do they relate to poetic devices? Okay, you could say this is more for the realm of theatre, but actually how does it apply to the fact that the author is performing their own work and is in a very intimate scenario, and how does that relate to poetry? Okay, so we're going to move on. Altered states of consciousness. This is where it all gets really mystic, and I really enjoyed writing a chapter in my book about this stuff, because when you're talking about live performance, you're talking about that liturgical tradition of heightened states of consciousness, ecstatic transport, physical exuberance, what Durkheim called collective effervescence, those group processes, those psychological dynamics of performance. Also, how do poets use warm-ups, visualization, breathing techniques to prepare themselves for performances? Hypnotism, how can we use our voice rhythmically? How can we guide people in a state of controlled dreaming through the Imaginarium? Okay, cool. So the social body, and I think this has received perhaps more attention than the actual artistic properties of performance poetics, because as an event-based art form, it gets really interesting. It's a network of gigs, it's a network of practices. You've got these rituals and competitions like we're seeing here today. Slam, I think, is fascinating because it's a highly ritualized event. Okay, this is a photograph from the Aitish poetry competitions in Kazakhstan. And you've got all these actors, you've got the MC, you've got the sacrificial poet, you've got the guest artist. How do all these things kind of come together in rituals? And I'm interested here in poetry as a form of play, and not playing with words on the page, with syllables and line lengths and et cetera, but how literature becomes a form of play, a form of social play, where how people are playing, the game of literature, so the social game of literature, essentially. The social interactions of spoken word. How do all these actors interact? This is a quote here from Helen Johnson, who's with us today from Brighton University. Local, translocal, and transnational networks of slams. Okay, how do we all link together? The interpersonal dynamics of the gig and the slam. How does the poem move through the room? And Jack McGowan here has done some interesting work at Worcester, talking about affect and the electrochemical journey of the poem, when you get groups and bodies of people, and how emotional contagion, or as John Hegley puts it, emotional participation, how that works in live performance, and how poets can manipulate bodies of people to impress their poetry on the human nervous system. Okay. So, spoken word education. I think anthropology and sociology really deepen our understanding of poetry, because they look at the poet as a networked being, okay, embedded poetics, okay, linguistic capital, social capital, cultural capital, intellectual capital. Now, when we fell in love with this art form, we've all, and this is true for me certainly, I found a way to move through the world. It gave me agency, right? I was able to campaign, I was able to educate, I was able to speak in public, okay? So what effect does this have when we start educating people to do it? What effect does that have on society at large? These forms of currency, how do they give people purchase? And I think these are big questions, and I think they deserve serious answer and serious study. When you're talking poetry, really you are talking education, especially with performance poetry, where people are embedding themselves in their communities. Eric Havelock talks about versified knowledge when he's talking about the oral tradition. I think that's very much alive and well. And the link between rhetoric and poetry, there's a lot of young people slamming here this weekend who are young, and by virtue of being young are very politically driven. And that's the right of young people, I think, to be idealistic. And you see how the rhetorical tradition exists in spoken word, and how people use it as a vehicle to give testimony and to see the world as to tell the world as they see it. So yeah, and obviously the political implications of that are really big. And given the challenges that our species face, I think what we're talking about here has big political import, really. So to summarise, spoken word is a set of artistic practices. It's a physiological event. It's a network of people, and it's a family of activities. Anthony Anaxagiri uses this term hybrid, a hybrid art form. I think it's a nice word to describe what we're looking at here. It's literary, but it's not literature. It's musical, but it's not music. It's theatrical, but it's not theatre. It's very often comic, but it's not comedy. It's spoken word poetry. Now, you could fit other things into this, but then I'd have to make a new graph. Now, I understand spoken word poetry is, for some people, a controversial term. Some people like to term themselves poets as perform and other things. But I think, for the sake of this is, I think it deserves to be looked at in this way. So this is a problematic photograph as well. This is how I want us all to leave today, right? All these different fields. And this is a complete map of all the different fields related to it. And there's probably many others that we could put in this as well. But it's very interdisciplinary, and there's many different angles that we can approach this. Okay. So where next? Is spoken word worthy of serious discussion? I think it is. I think in honour of what we're doing here, let's do some call and response. Is spoken word worthy of serious discussion? Yes. Is it worthy of formal training? Let's have a look at this. I believe there's a problem of maturity in spoken word. This is one of our only septuagenarians on the scene. This is David Lee Morgan. Often when we think of spoken word, we think of inclusivity, we think of accessibility, we think of something which is fun, young, dynamic. And this is great, right? Events like this are really the engine of spoken word because they create lots of new poets. But what happens after that? Actually, when you get to your kind of late 30s, early 40s, the poets start dropping away, which means we have a crisis of eldership. And there's many reasons for this, the state of the artistic economy, etc., etc. But it risks, I think, becoming an infantilized art form because we're not keeping hold of our elders. And one of the reasons I think that is because often practitioners, they get to a certain level and they get bored because there isn't a critical discussion around this art form. It's growing, that's changing rapidly. But in order to keep poets and in order to keep audiences, the art form needs to engage in serious training, I think. Because I've seen so many incredible poets, organic intellectuals, okay? So people who are not manufactured in the academy, but are developing very complex crafts in a lived conversation with the stage. And when I fell in love with spoken word, the person who got me into spoken word is here, Steve Larkin, the founder of Hammer and Tongue. And when I saw what Steve was doing and the people that he was bringing in to Hammer and Tongue events, and I could see there was a huge amount of expertise, and I started to look for books that would talk about that expertise, the way they were working audiences, the way they were traveling to different parts of the world and tailoring their materials to different audiences there. And I couldn't find any books that were actually talking about that. And we need to create those books, and we really need to create spaces in our education institutions so that those people can teach and be studied, I think. How do poets train? There are very established methods for training page poets, right? And not many of the people I grew up with on slam and spoken word stages then went on to do an Arvon retreat, and then, there were established routes, right? But what about spoken word? There really aren't. This is actually an interesting initiative. This is a Hip Yak Poetry School in the West Country. It's the first one that happened last year, dedicated to the spoken word community. So I think this is a really interesting development. Here's a few provocations. Is there too much poetry in spoken word? If we look at spoken word as a performance discipline, as a performing art, as a form of live entertainment, if we link it to the traditions of avant-garde experimental poetics and the movements of popular music such as punk, dub, etc., then if we are moving towards a more sort of literary standard for how we accredit poetry, then we're moving away from a lot of invention and a lot of experimental activity. So I would ask this question, is there too much poetry in spoken word? Spoken word studies, could that be a thing? Does it have to be a thing? It's not inconceivable that you would create a formal space for spoken word in universities, right? Spoken word has created spaces for itself in the world of funding. It's done so in the world of festivals and festivals like the Ed Fringe, where it has its own section of the brochure. So it's not inconceivable that you might have maybe a journal or departments that dedicate themselves specifically to this. And this was a question that was brought up in the thread, as the email thread on the way up here. Can spoken word in universities remain practitioner-led? Will we disappear up our own arses? You know, can you be a democratic literary movement and have a cadre of intellectuals in the university? How can we use universities to support the scene? We all know how difficult it is to earn a living, and how can we link the academy to the scene of spoken word? I want to finish with this quote from Lem Sissay. We are living through the most exciting time in poetry in this century and the previous century. This was a considered quote from the Apples and Snakes archive, an interview that he did. He was comparing the scene now to how it was in the 1960s, when there was a big renaissance then. And I think he's right. And I think this is important work, actually. This is not just a vocational gathering. We're gathered here today, dearly beloved, because this is about enchantment. It's about changing the world. It's about dreaming. It's about power. If you're talking language, you're talking testimony. You're talking change, right? So this is really important stuff. And as I say, the thrust of this is that the work that we're doing deserves serious discussion and formal training. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.